Picture a wall of dark beer, taller than your house, roaring down a city street. This actually happened. In London, more than 200 years ago, a flood of beer killed 8 people. And here's the part that still makes your jaw drop. The people who caused it never paid a single penny. Stick around, because the ending is somehow stranger than the flood itself. Let me take you back to the year 1814. Beer wasn't just a drink in London back then. Dark, heavy porter was the fuel of the whole city. Working people drank it like water, and the big breweries made an absolute fortune. This stuff was so central to daily life, it's hard to picture now. It even got its name from the porters, the workers who hauled goods around the markets. They drank so much of it that the beer took their name. Cheap, dark, and everywhere you looked. But to make beer that cheap, you had to age it for months. Some of it sat for the better part of a year before anyone drank a drop. And that meant storing it in giant wooden tanks. Now, here's where human ego walks into the story. The breweries started competing over who could build the biggest tank. Not the best beer, just the biggest tank. It was pure showing off. A brewery with the largest tank in the world had bragging rights over every rival in the city. Bigger tank, bigger reputation, bigger ego. And I'm not exaggerating how silly this got. One brewery threw a dinner party inside a fresh tank before they filled it. Over 100 guests sat down to eat a full meal inside a beer barrel. That was the culture we're talking about. None of it was really about the beer anymore. It was about being the biggest name in London. So a brewery owner named Henry Mew wanted the crown too. His name is spelled M-E-U-X, but you say it Muse. And this part is almost too perfect. He was chasing a record his own father had set. Years earlier, the two of them had a bitter falling out. The father had built the biggest beer tank anyone had ever seen. So, this wasn't just business. It was a son trying to prove something to his own dad. He built a wooden tank over 20 feet tall. Picture a 2-story building made of wood, filled right to the brim with beer. Massive iron rings wrapped around it to hold the whole thing together. It was packed to within a few inches of the top. Months of dark porter sitting there, pushing outward on the wood every single day. And where did he decide to put this monster? Right on the edge of one of the poorest slums in all of London. Think about that for a second. On one side of a brick wall, beer tanks the size of houses. On the other side, families crammed into damp basement rooms. This was one of the roughest corners of the whole city. It was the same neighborhood a famous painter once used to show London at its most desperate and drunk. Overcrowded, poor, and forgotten by almost everyone with money. The kind of place people with means simply looked away from. And its next-door neighbor was a wall holding back an ocean of beer. Nobody ever stopped to ask a simple question. What happens if that wall breaks? October 1814. A late afternoon, like any other. A brewery worker named George Crick was doing his rounds, and he noticed something wrong. One of those giant iron rings had slipped loose from the tank. This single ring weighed about as much as a grand piano. Now Crick, to his credit, did the right thing. He reported it straight to his boss, and his boss basically shrugged it off. Rings slipped a few times a year, he said. No harm ever came of it. So, Crick went back to work. An hour slipped by. Just a normal, quiet hour, with the tank sitting there like always. Nobody in that building had any idea they were living on borrowed time. He even had a note in his hand about getting it repaired later. And here's a detail that makes it hit even harder. Crick's own brother was working somewhere in that same brewery, and that is the exact moment it happened. The tank didn't crack. It didn't spring a slow leak. It exploded. In an instant. No warning, no time to run. 1 second the tank was standing, and the next, it simply wasn't. One witness said it gave way as completely as a cup knocked over on a table. The blast ripped the tap clean off a second tank standing nearby. So, now you've got 2 giant tanks emptying at the same time. A wave of beer, 15 feet high, came crashing out. That's taller than 2 grown men standing on each other's shoulders. It smashed straight through the brewery's back wall, a brick wall over 20 feet high, more than 2 bricks thick. Gone like it was made of paper. And then the wave hit the street. It swallowed the houses whole, basements filled with beer in seconds. People scrambled onto tables and furniture just to keep their heads above it. Imagine that for a second. Not water rising in your home, but warm, dark beer, the smell of it filling every room while the walls come apart around you. And it wasn't only the beer that did the killing. The blast hurled heavy timber and broken brick across the street. Roofs and walls of the nearest houses caved in on the people trapped inside. Now, stop and think about who was home on a weekday afternoon. The working men were all out at their jobs, so almost everyone standing in the path of that wave was a woman or a child. A 14-year-old girl was washing mugs in the yard of a pub. Her name was Eleanor Cooper. The heavy brewery wall came down right on top of her. A little girl was sitting down to tea with her mother, and in one small house, a family was holding a wake. They were mourning a 2-year-old boy who had just died. 5 people at that wake drowned before they even understood what was happening. They had gathered to grieve one small death, and the flood took 5 more from that single room. 8 people died that afternoon, and not one of them died from drinking. They were crushed, buried, and drowned in a matter of minutes. Crick's brother was one of the lucky ones, pulled out of the wreckage alive. Most of his neighbors never got that chance. So, what happens when a company's beer kills 8 people? Surely somebody paid for this, right? Let me show you how justice worked in 1814. They held an inquest just 2 days later. The jury walked through the wrecked brewery with their own eyes. They looked at the bodies. They listened to Crick describe the whole nightmare, and then they handed down their verdict. The deaths were, and I'm quoting them here, casual, accidental, and by misfortune. In plain English, they called it an act of God. An act of God. Not the ring that slipped, not the boss who shrugged, not the man who built a 2-story beer bomb next to a slum. No, they decided God did it. It's almost hard to believe when you read it today. An entire company, completely off the hook, because the law called a broken tank divine will. So the brewery paid the victims' families exactly nothing, not a cent. But hang on, because it actually gets worse. The company had lost a lot of money in that flood. So they went to Parliament with a request. They asked for their beer tax back, the tax they had already paid on all that spilled beer. And believe it or not, they got it. The government handed the brewery a refund. The families of the dead got nothing. And the company that killed them got a check in the mail. Let that one sit with you for a moment. The state wouldn't spare a single coin for 8 dead women and children. But it happily paid back the man whose tank had killed them. That refund was actually big enough to save the brewery from going under. So, the disaster that killed 8 people barely scratched the business. If you tried to write that into a story, nobody would believe you. Now, over the years, this story grew a legend around it. People love to say the crowds ran into the streets and drank the flood dry, that there was a wild, drunken party right there in the wreckage. Some even claim a 9th person died of drinking days later. But here's the honest truth. The newspapers from 1814 described none of that. They wrote about crowds standing in near total silence, people digging quietly, listening for survivors trapped under the rubble. Neighbors clawed through the debris with their bare hands, calling names into the dark. And remember, the papers of that time had no love for this poor immigrant neighborhood. If there had been drunken chaos in the streets, they would have gladly printed every word of it. The wild party is just folklore that piled up over 200 years. The real ending is quieter and honestly a lot sadder. The disaster did finally kill off the giant wooden tank. Breweries gave them up, and the whole industry changed because of this one afternoon. And the spot where it all happened, today, a famous theater stands right on top of it. Thousands of people walk past that door every single night, and there isn't one plaque to tell them what happened on that ground. The only ones who still remember are a handful of locals. Once a year, a nearby pub raises a quiet glass to the people who died here. 8 people died under a wave of beer, and the only bill anyone ever paid was a tax refund, handed right back to the brewery. If this story got under your skin, do me one small favor. Drop a comment below with another forgotten disaster you want me to dig up next.